My name is Zara, and I am 26 years old. 3 weeks ago, my sister accidentally sent me a voice memo that was meant for our mother. What I heard in that 60-second recording completely shattered my understanding of family loyalty and exposed a betrayal so deep that it reached back 15 years into our family history. The truth about my father's death, my inheritance, and the people I trusted most was about to unravel everything. But here is the thing about family secrets. Once they surface, there is no going back to pretending they never existed. Before we dive into this family revenge drama that changed my entire life, let me know where you are watching from. Hit that like button if you are ready for some serious family karma, and subscribe because this story has more twists than a soap opera. Trust me, you will want to see how this all plays out. The voice memo arrived on a Tuesday morning while I was having coffee before work. My phone buzzed, and I saw my sister Delilah's name on the screen with an audio message. Nothing unusual there, she often sent voice memos instead of texts. But when I pressed play, the first words made my blood run cold. Mom, I cannot keep doing this anymore. The guilt is eating me alive, and seeing Zara so happy and trusting makes me sick to my stomach. We need to tell her the truth about what we did to get Dad's money. I nearly dropped my phone. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. This was clearly not meant for me. Delilah had accidentally sent this to me instead of our mother. But I could not stop listening. Her voice continued, shaky and emotional. I know we agreed never to talk about it, but watching her struggle to pay off her student loans while we have been living comfortably off money that should have been hers feels wrong. She thinks Dad left everything to you because she was rebellious in college, but we both know that is not true. We forged those documents, Mom. We changed his will after he died, and we have been lying about it for 15 years. The world seemed to stop spinning. I sat there in my tiny apartment, staring at my phone like it was a bomb that had just exploded in my hands. My father died when I was 11, and my mother had always told me that he left his entire estate to her because I was too young and irresponsible. She said he was disappointed in my grades and my attitude. I had carried that shame my entire adult life, believing that my own father did not think I was worthy of inheriting anything. But according to this voice memo, that was all a lie. Delilah's voice went on, and the life insurance money too. Remember how we split that between us while telling Zara there was not any? She deserves to know that Dad actually left her half of everything. The house, the savings, the investments, all of it was supposed to be split 3 ways, not just between you and me. I felt like I was going to throw up. My sister, who was 3 years older than me and had always been our mother's favorite, had been living in a beautiful house that should have been partially mine. My mother, who had spent years lecturing me about responsibility and hard work while I struggled to make ends meet, had been enjoying money that belonged to me. The recording continued with more devastating details. I have been thinking about this ever since Zara lost her job last month. She is so stressed about money, and here we are with all this wealth that came from fraud. What if someone finds out? What if there are legal consequences? And honestly, what if karma comes for us? I cannot sleep at night knowing what we did. My mother's response was not audible since this was just Delilah's side of a phone conversation, but I could infer from my sister's replies that our mother was not interested in confessing. I know, we have talked about this before. You keep saying that Zara would not have been responsible with the money at 11, and maybe that was true then, but she is 26 now, Mom. She has a college degree, a career, and she has proven herself. Meanwhile, I bought that expensive car last year with Dad's money while watching her take the bus to work. The final part of the message was what really broke me. I love you, Mom, but I cannot live with this secret anymore. Either we tell Zara together, or I am going to tell her myself. She deserves to know that Dad actually wrote in his will that he was proud of her and wanted to make sure she was taken care of. She deserves to know that we stole that from her. The message ended, and I sat in complete silence for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Everything I thought I knew about my family was a lie. My father had not been disappointed in me. My mother and sister had made that up to cover their crime. The financial struggles I had endured, the student debt, the cheap apartments, the second-hand clothes, all of it was unnecessary. I should have inherited enough money to live comfortably, to pursue my dreams without worrying about bills. But more than the money, what hurt was the betrayal. These were the two people I loved most in the world, the people I had leaned on after Dad died, the people who had comforted me when I cried about feeling unloved by him. They had held me while I sobbed about not being good enough, all while knowing they had stolen my inheritance and lied about his final wishes. I called in sick to work that day. I could not function. I kept replaying the voice memo, taking notes, trying to process the magnitude of what I had discovered. My sister's guilt was evident, but what scared me was realizing that this conversation implied they had discussed my inheritance many times over the years. This was not a one-time mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. This was an ongoing conspiracy that had shaped my entire adult life. I started thinking about all the times my mother had refused to help me financially, claiming she was on a fixed income. All the times Delilah had bought expensive things while I was eating ramen noodles for dinner. All the family gatherings where they had subtly reinforced the narrative that Dad had not trusted me with money, making me feel like a disappointment even in death. The worst part was that I had internalized their lies. I had worked twice as hard to prove myself worthy, thinking I was making up for being a failure in my father's eyes. I had chosen practical career paths over my artistic dreams because I thought I could not afford to take risks. I had turned down social opportunities because I was always worried about money. My entire personality had been shaped by the belief that I was somehow less deserving, less responsible, less loved. As the day wore on, I realized I had a choice to make. I could confront them directly, but that would give them time to prepare their defense or cover their tracks. Or I could do some investigating first, gather evidence, and figure out exactly what they had done and how they had done it. The lawyer in me, because yes, I had gone to law school with loans instead of family money, knew that if they had forged legal documents and committed fraud, there might be criminal charges involved. But the daughter in me was still hoping there was some explanation, some misunderstanding. By evening, I had made my decision. I was going to investigate this thoroughly before I said anything to anyone. I needed to know the full extent of their betrayal before I decided how to respond. And something told me that this voice memo was just the tip of the iceberg. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of clarity. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by something colder and more calculating. I had spent the night researching inheritance fraud, document forgery, and statute of limitations laws. What I discovered was both encouraging and terrifying. In my state, there was no statute of limitations on inheritance fraud if it could be proven that the beneficiaries actively concealed their crimes. Every year they had hidden this from me reset the clock. This was not some old crime they could claim was too far in the past to prosecute. This was an ongoing conspiracy that had continued every single day for 15 years. I called my office and took the rest of the week off, claiming a family emergency. Technically, it was true. I needed time to build a case, and I needed to do it without alerting my mother and sister to what I had discovered. My first stop was the county courthouse. Public records are, well, public, and I had every right to request copies of my father's will and death certificate. What I found there made my stomach turn. The will on file showed that my father had indeed left everything to my mother, exactly as she had always claimed. But something felt wrong about it. I had studied document analysis in law school, and there were subtle inconsistencies that caught my attention. The signature looked slightly different from other documents I found with my father's name. The paper stock seemed newer than other documents from the same time period. Most tellingly, the will was dated just 2 weeks before his death, which struck me as suspicious since he had been in the hospital, heavily sedated, during that time. I made copies of everything and then drove to the hospital where my father had died. After some persistence and a small donation to their record-keeping fund, I was able to access his medical records from his final month. What I discovered confirmed my suspicions. During the 2 weeks when the will was supposedly signed, my father had been either unconscious or so heavily medicated that he would not have been capable of making legal decisions. The medical records showed that he had been on a ventilator for the last 10 days of his life. There was no way he could have signed a will during that period. Yet the will was notarized with a date from that exact time frame. Armed with this evidence, I reached out to a private investigator who specialized in inheritance fraud. Detective Martinez was a middle-aged woman who had seen every kind of family betrayal imaginable. When I showed her what I had found, she was not surprised. "This happens more often than you would think," she told me during our first meeting. Family members forge wills, destroy original documents, bribe witnesses. The sad truth is that grief makes people vulnerable, and some family members take advantage of that vulnerability. She agreed to help me investigate further, but she warned me about the emotional toll. Once we start digging, we usually find that the fraud goes deeper than initially suspected. Are you prepared for that possibility? I thought I was, but I was wrong. Detective Martinez started by tracking down the notary who had supposedly witnessed my father's will signing. It took her less than a week to find him, and when she did, the story became even more disturbing. The notary, now retired, clearly remembered the incident because it had bothered him for years. "That woman came to me with documents that were already signed," he told Detective Martinez during a recorded phone interview that she later played for me. She claimed her husband had signed them at the hospital but needed them notarized for legal purposes. She was crying, said her husband was dying, begged me to help her. I knew I should not notarize something I had not witnessed being signed, but she seemed so desperate, and I felt sorry for her. He went on to explain that my mother had paid him extra money for his discretion and had made him promise never to mention the unusual circumstances to anyone. "I have regretted it ever since," he said. "I knew it was not right, but she convinced me that her husband really had signed the papers and that she just needed help with the technicalities." So my mother had not just forged my father's signature, she had manipulated a grieving notary into becoming an unwitting accomplice to her fraud. The level of premeditation was staggering. But Detective Martinez was not done. She had also tracked down the lawyer who had supposedly drafted the will. Here's where things got even more interesting. The lawyer had no record of ever meeting with my father. In fact, he had a clear recollection of my mother coming to him alone, claiming that her husband was too ill to travel but had dictated his wishes to her. "I advised her that this was not the proper way to create a will," the lawyer told Detective Martinez. "I told her that her husband needed to be present, needed to sign in front of witnesses, and that the whole situation seemed irregular. She became very upset and left my office. I never heard from her again." So the lawyer had refused to participate in the fraud, which meant my mother had found another way to create the fake will. Detective Martinez was able to trace the document to a legal aid clinic where a young, inexperienced paralegal had prepared the paperwork based on my mother's claims that her husband had already approved the contents. The paralegal, now a successful lawyer herself, remembered the case clearly because it had been her first week on the job. "The woman seemed so grief-stricken, and I was trying to be helpful," she explained. "She showed me a handwritten note that she claimed was her husband's wishes, and I helped her format it into a proper legal document. I had no idea that the handwriting was not actually his." Detective Martinez asked to see this handwritten note, and when the paralegal found it in her old files, everything became crystal clear. The handwriting was unmistakably my sister Delilah's. I knew because she had helped me with homework throughout my childhood, and her distinctive way of writing certain letters was impossible to miss. So here was the full picture. My mother and sister had conspired to create a fake will using Delilah's handwriting. They had fooled a grieving notary into falsely witnessing the signature. They had manipulated a naive paralegal into creating a professional-looking legal document. And they had spent 15 years lying to my face about my father's final wishes. But I still needed to find the original will, the real one. And I needed to understand how they had intercepted and destroyed it before it could be filed with the court. Detective Martinez suggested we search my mother's house. If she kept the fake will all these years, she might have kept the real one too. Some criminals keep trophies of their crimes, and others keep evidence as insurance against co-conspirators. The thought of searching my mother's house felt like crossing a line I could not uncross. But I had already come this far, and I needed to know the complete truth. We planned the search for the following weekend when I knew my mother would be out of town visiting her sister. I still had a key from my college days when I used to house sit for her. Using that key now felt like another betrayal, but I reminded myself who the real criminal was in this situation. What we found in her bedroom closet changed everything I thought I knew about the depth of their deception. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity I had never experienced before. For the first time in my adult life, I understood exactly why my existence had always felt precarious, why I had always felt like I was one mistake away from losing everything, why I had never been able to get ahead financially despite working harder than anyone I knew. It was because my family had deliberately structured things to keep me on the outside. I called in sick to both of my jobs and spent the day making phone calls and doing research. First, I contacted the lawyer who had handled my grandfather's estate. His secretary initially told me he could not discuss the trust with me since I was not a beneficiary, but when I explained that I was Harold Morrison's granddaughter and had just discovered my adoption, she put me through immediately. "Miss Morrison, Mr. Patterson said when he picked up the phone, "I have to say, I wondered when this call would come." "You wondered when this call would come? What does that mean?" "Your grandfather specifically asked me to make sure that if you ever contacted my office asking about the trust, I should be completely transparent with you. He left a sealed letter with instructions that it should only be opened if you discovered the truth about your adoption." My heart started pounding. "What does the letter say?" "I think you should come to my office to read it yourself." "Are you available this afternoon?" 2 hours later, I was sitting in Mr. Patterson's wood-paneled office while he handed me an envelope with my name written in my grandfather's familiar handwriting. Inside was a letter dated just 3 months before his death. "My dearest Sophia," it began. "If you are reading this, it means you have discovered the truth about your adoption and the trust. I want you to know that excluding you from the trust was one of the most difficult decisions I ever made, but I did it to protect you from something I discovered about your parents and Emma. 3 years ago, I learned that your father has been stealing money from his employer for over a decade. Not small amounts, substantial sums that he has been using to fund Emma's lifestyle and maintain the family's standard of living. Your mother knows about this theft and has been helping him hide it. I also discovered that Emma has been aware of the theft since she turned 18 and has been actively participating in laundering the money through various schemes. I could not include you in the trust because I knew that Robert would find a way to steal that money too, and I could not bear the thought of my legacy being used to fund criminal activity. But I also could not bear the thought of you being implicated in their crimes when you are clearly the only honest person in the family. I have been watching you work multiple jobs and struggle financially while your family lives comfortably on stolen money, and it breaks my heart. You deserve so much better than the family you were born into, and you deserve so much better than the family that adopted you. I have set up a separate account that Emma and your parents do not know about. By the time you read this letter, it will have grown to a substantial amount. Mr. Patterson has the details. This money is yours, but only if you promise me that you will use it to build a life away from people who have been lying to you for so long. I love you, sweetheart. You have always been the light of this family, and I hope someday you will understand that being excluded from this trust was my way of protecting you, not punishing you. Your loving grandfather, Harold. I was crying by the time I finished reading, but they were not tears of sadness. They were tears of vindication and relief. My grandfather had seen what I had been too trusting to see. He had known what my family really was. The account he mentioned, Mr. Patterson said gently, currently has a balance of $137,000. I stared at him. "I'm sorry, what?" Your grandfather set aside $50,000 15 years ago and invested it conservatively. With compound interest and the fact that you never knew about it to spend it, it has grown substantially. The money is yours whenever you are ready to claim it. I walked out of that office with a cashier's check in my purse and a plan forming in my mind. But first, I needed to understand the full scope of what my family had been hiding from me. I spent the next 3 days conducting what I can only describe as forensic research into my own family. I requested employment records for my father through a private investigator who specialized in financial crimes. What I learned was that Dad worked as an accountant for a mid-sized construction company, and according to the investigator's preliminary findings, there were definitely irregularities in the company's books that coincided with my family's improved financial situation over the past decade. I also hired a different private investigator to look into Emma's activities. What she found was that Emma had never had a traditional job, but she had been involved in several business ventures that appeared to be fronts for money laundering. The investigator found records of Emma opening and closing multiple small businesses over the past few years, each of which had suspicious financial patterns that suggested they existed primarily to move money around rather than to provide actual goods or services. Everything my grandfather had written in his letter was true. My family was not just wealthy, they were criminals. And I was the only one who had been kept in the dark about it. On Friday evening, I drove to Emma's townhouse. I had not spoken to any of my family since the devastating phone call with my mother, and I could see through the window that my parents' car was in Emma's driveway. They were all there, probably strategizing about how to handle the fact that I had discovered the truth. I knocked on the door, and Emma answered with a surprised expression that quickly shifted to wariness. "Sophia. We have been trying to reach you." "I am sure you have. Can I come in?" "I think we need to have a family meeting." Emma led me into her beautifully decorated living room where my parents were sitting on her expensive sofa looking uncomfortable and guilty. The contrast between this room and my tiny apartment felt even more stark now that I understood exactly how this wealth had been acquired. "So," I said, sitting down in the chair across from them, "I have had an interesting few days. I learned that I am adopted, which was apparently common knowledge to everyone except me. I learned that Dad has been stealing money from his employer for over a decade. I learned that Emma has been helping launder that money. And I learned that Grandpa Harold knew all of this and specifically excluded me from his trust to protect me from being implicated in your crimes." The silence in the room was deafening. "I also learned," I continued, "that Grandpa Harold left me a letter and a substantial amount of money that he hid from all of you, because he understood what kind of people you really are." Emma's face went pale. "What are you talking about?" I smiled for the first time in days. "I am talking about the fact that while you have been living off stolen money and inheritance payments, I have been working 3 jobs and struggling to survive. And now I am talking about the fact that you asked me to give you my life savings while sitting in a house paid for with embezzled funds." Dad finally spoke up. "Sophia, you do not understand the whole situation." "Actually, Dad, I understand the situation perfectly. What I do not understand is how you all thought you could keep lying to me forever. But here is what I do understand now: you are all criminals, and I am done pretending to be part of this family." I stood up and looked around Emma's beautiful living room one more time. "Emma, remember when you said I would learn some things about our family that I had been too naive to figure out? You were right. I learned that you are all thieves and liars. And now you are going to learn something about me that you have been too arrogant to figure out." I walked toward the door, and Emma jumped up to follow me. "Sophia, wait. What does that mean?" I turned back to look at her, and I could see the fear in her eyes now. She was starting to understand that something had fundamentally changed. "It means that your comfortable life built on stolen money is about to come to an end. And unlike you, when I destroy someone's world, I am going to do it legally." The look of panic that crossed Emma's face as I closed the door behind me was the most satisfying thing I had seen in years. Would you believe that this was just the beginning of my family's downfall? Because what I did next would expose everything they had been hiding and force them to face consequences they never thought would catch up with them. The justice that followed was more complete than I ever could have imagined. Monday morning, I walked into the offices of both the FBI's Financial Crimes Division and my father's employer with evidence that would destroy my family's criminal enterprise. But I did not go alone, and I did not go unprepared. Over the weekend, I had used part of my inheritance to hire the best financial crimes attorney in the city. Sarah Chen was a former federal prosecutor who specialized in embezzlement and money laundering cases. When I showed her all the evidence I had gathered, her eyes lit up in a way that told me she knew exactly how to handle this situation. "Your family has been incredibly sloppy," Sarah told me during our Sunday meeting. "The paper trail for this kind of systematic theft and laundering is extensive. With the documentation you have provided and the cooperation you are willing to give, we can build a case that will result in serious federal charges." The first stop was my father's employer, Morrison Construction Company. I had made an appointment with the CEO, explaining that I had information about financial irregularities involving one of his employees. When I walked into that conference room with my attorney and handed over evidence of my father's decade-long embezzlement scheme, I watched a man's face go through every stage of betrayal and rage. "Robert Morrison has been stealing from us for 10 years? CEO Michael Torres asked, flipping through the documentation Sarah had prepared. "How much money are we talking about?" "Based on the financial analysis," Sarah replied, "we estimate approximately $400,000 over the past decade." The thefts were small enough to avoid immediate detection but consistent enough to fund a significantly elevated lifestyle for his family. Mr. Torres was quiet for a long time, studying the papers. "This explains some discrepancies we have noticed but could never pinpoint. Robert always volunteered to handle certain accounts personally, and he was always very protective of his filing systems. He was also very careful about timing," I added. "He never took large amounts at once, and he always made sure the thefts coincided with busy periods when detailed auditing was less likely." 2 hours later, we walked out of that building knowing that my father would be suspended immediately and that Morrison Construction would be filing criminal charges by the end of the week. Our next stop was the FBI field office downtown. Special Agent Rebecca Martinez specialized in financial crimes, and when Sarah called ahead to arrange our meeting, Agent Martinez cleared her entire afternoon. "This is impressive work," Agent Martinez said after reviewing our evidence. "Most financial crime cases take months of investigation to develop this level of documentation. You have essentially done our job for us." I felt a grim satisfaction as I watched her organize the evidence into official case files. My family made one crucial mistake. They assumed I would never be smart enough to figure out what they were doing. They underestimated me for 28 years, and that arrogance is going to cost them everything. Agent Martinez looked up from the documents. "I have to ask, Sophia, are you prepared for what comes next? Once we begin this investigation officially, there is no going back. Your family will face federal charges, potential prison time, and complete financial ruin." I thought about Emma's condescending tone when she asked for my savings. I thought about years of watching my parents treat me like a burden while secretly living off stolen money. I thought about my grandfather's letter and his heartbreak over what his family had become. "Agent Martinez, my family has been committing crimes for a decade while watching me work 3 jobs just to survive. They lied to me about my adoption, excluded me from inheritance money, and asked me to give them my savings while they were living in houses paid for with embezzled funds. I am not just prepared for what comes next. I have been planning it." By Wednesday, the dominoes started falling exactly as I had orchestrated. Dad was arrested at work in front of all his colleagues. The FBI raided Emma's townhouse and found records of her money laundering operation hidden in a safe behind a painting in her bedroom. Mom was arrested as an accessory when agents found evidence that she had been helping to hide and move the stolen money through various bank accounts. I watched the local news coverage from my apartment that evening, seeing my family members being led away in handcuffs. The reporter mentioned that the investigation was ongoing and that additional charges were likely. But I was not done. I had one more card to play. Thursday morning, I drove to the offices of the Internal Revenue Service. My family had been living off stolen and laundered money for years, but I was willing to bet they had not been properly reporting that income on their tax returns. I requested a meeting with an IRS investigator and handed over documentation showing the discrepancy between my family's reported income and their actual lifestyle. Tax evasion charges will be separate from the federal embezzlement charges, the IRS investigator explained. If your family has been living off unreported income for a decade, they could owe hundreds of thousands of dollars in back taxes, penalties, and interest. Good, I said simply. I want them to face every possible consequence for what they have done. That afternoon, I received a phone call from a number I did not recognize. Sophia, this is David Morrison, your father's brother. I think we need to talk. Uncle David was someone I had only met a few times at family gatherings. He lived across the country and had never been particularly close to our immediate family. Uncle David, if you are calling to ask me to drop the charges against Dad and Emma, you are wasting your time. Actually, Sophia, I am calling to tell you that I have been suspicious of your father's finances for years. Robert always seemed to have more money than his salary could support, and Emma's lifestyle never made sense given that she never seemed to have a real job. When I saw the news coverage, everything finally clicked into place. He paused before continuing. I want you to know that I support what you are doing. Your grandfather Harold called me before he died and told me he was worried about Robert and Emma. Harold suspected they were involved in something illegal, and he made me promise that if anything ever happened to expose their crimes, I would make sure you were protected. Protected how? Harold left another letter with me, Sophia. A letter that explains some things about your adoption that you deserve to know. Would you be willing to meet with me this weekend? I can fly out there. As I hung up the phone, I realized that even from the grave, my grandfather was still protecting me and making sure I had allies in my fight for justice. Emma and my parents had always assumed that I was alone and powerless, but they were about to learn that they had been wrong about that too. The systematic destruction of my family's criminal empire was proceeding exactly as I had planned, but apparently, I was about to discover that this story had even more layers than I had realized. By Friday afternoon, the full scope of my family's downfall was becoming clear, and it was more comprehensive than even I had anticipated. The local news was calling it one of the most extensive family-based financial crime operations uncovered in the city's history. Dad's employer had conducted an emergency audit and discovered that the embezzlement was even worse than we had initially calculated. Morrison Construction was estimating losses of over $600,000, and they were preparing to file both criminal charges and a civil lawsuit to recover the stolen funds. The company's attorney called my attorney to let us know that they were also considering charges against Emma for receiving and laundering the stolen money. Emma's money laundering operation turned out to be more sophisticated than I had realized. The FBI had traced her fake businesses through a network of shell companies that connected to money laundering operations in 3 different states. What I had thought was just my family's crime had apparently been part of a larger criminal network, and Emma was facing federal charges that could result in decades in prison. Mom was released on bail, but only after posting bond using the family home as collateral. She called me Thursday evening, crying and begging me to consider dropping the charges. Sophia, please, you have to understand that we never meant to hurt you. We were just trying to provide a good life for our family. Mom, you stole money for 10 years while watching me work 3 jobs and eat ramen noodles for dinner. You lied to me about being adopted and excluded me from family inheritance. You participated in money laundering. At what point in that decade of crime did you think about providing a good life for me? We always planned to tell you about the adoption when the time was right. And we always planned to help you financially once you got more established. When the time was right? I am 28 years old, Mom. When exactly would the time have been right? And help me financially with what money? The money Dad stole from his employer, or the money Emma got from Grandpa Harold's trust that I was excluded from? She could not answer that question because there was no answer that would make any of this acceptable. Uncle David arrived Saturday morning, and meeting him felt like stepping into an alternate version of my family. He was kind, straightforward, and genuinely concerned about my well-being in a way that I realized I had never experienced from my immediate family. "Your grandfather's letter," he said, handing me another envelope with my name on it, "explains why you were really put up for adoption, and why Harold was so determined to protect you from Robert and Emma." This letter was longer and more detailed than the first one. According to my grandfather, my birth mother had been a young woman named Jennifer who had worked as a bookkeeper for one of his businesses. She had discovered that Robert, who was managing that particular business location, had been stealing money from the company. When Jennifer threatened to report the theft, Robert had convinced her to stay quiet by promising to marry her and make things right. But Robert had no intention of making things right. Instead, he had convinced Jennifer that they should give up the baby for adoption to start fresh, and then he had systematically isolated her from her family and friends. When Jennifer died in a car accident when I was 2 years old, my grandfather discovered evidence that suggested Robert had been emotionally and financially abusing her for years. "Harold felt responsible for your mother's death," Uncle David explained. "He believed that if he had been paying closer attention to Robert's behavior, Jennifer might still be alive. When Robert and Linda asked to adopt you, Harold agreed because he wanted to keep you in the family, but he always regretted not fighting harder for custody himself." The letter went on to explain that my grandfather had been quietly investigating Robert's financial activities for years, trying to gather enough evidence to stop him without destroying the entire family. When Harold discovered the extent of Robert and Emma's criminal activities, he realized that the only way to protect me was to exclude me from the family trust while secretly setting aside money for me to discover later. "He wanted you to have the resources to escape from them when you inevitably discovered what they really were," Uncle David said. "Harold knew that someday you would figure out the truth, and he wanted to make sure you had the means to build a better life." I sat in Uncle David's hotel room reading the letter and trying to process the fact that my birth mother had died because she had tried to do the right thing about Robert's theft, and that Robert had been stealing money for even longer than I had realized. This was not just about the past decade at Morrison Construction. This had been a pattern of criminal behavior spanning my entire life. Sunday morning, I woke up to find 17 missed calls from Emma. She had been released on bail, and apparently, she was finally beginning to understand the severity of her situation. Her voicemail messages started out angry and demanding, but by the end, she was crying and begging me to call her back. I did not call her back. Instead, I met with my attorney to discuss the next phase of our plan. "The federal charges are proceeding smoothly," Sarah told me. "Your family is looking at serious prison time, and the civil lawsuits will ensure that they lose everything they acquired with stolen money. But there is one more thing we should consider." "What is that?" "Your birth mother's family. If Jennifer was essentially murdered because she threatened to expose Robert's crimes, her family deserves to know the truth. They may also have grounds for a wrongful death lawsuit." That afternoon, I made the most difficult phone call of my life. I contacted Jennifer's sister, my biological aunt, and told her everything I had learned about what had really happened to her sister 26 years ago. "Jennifer called me the week before she died," Aunt Rachel said through tears. "She said she had discovered something about Robert's finances and that she was scared. She said he had been threatening her, but she would not give me details. After she died, I always suspected there was more to the story, but I could never prove anything." By Sunday evening, the criminal case against my family had expanded to include potential charges related to my birth mother's death. Rachel had agreed to cooperate with the investigation and had provided the FBI with evidence that Jennifer had been planning to leave Robert just before her death. As I sat in my apartment that night, surrounded by legal documents and evidence of my family's crimes, I realized that what had started as my quest for answers about Emma's demand for my savings had uncovered a criminal enterprise that had destroyed multiple lives over decades. But I was not done yet. There was one final phase of justice that needed to be served, and it involved making sure that my family faced not just legal consequences, but complete social and financial ruin. 6 months later, I stood in the courthouse listening to the judge sentence my family for their crimes. Emma received 12 years in federal prison for money laundering and participation in an organized criminal enterprise. Dad received 15 years for embezzlement, tax evasion, and charges related to my birth mother's death. Mom received 8 years as an accessory to the financial crimes. But the legal consequences were only part of the justice they faced. The civil lawsuits had resulted in the seizure of all their assets. Emma's townhouse, my parents' home, their cars, their bank accounts, everything they had acquired with stolen money was taken to pay restitution to Morrison Construction and other victims. Emma was left with nothing but prison uniforms and the knowledge that her comfortable life had been built on a foundation of lies and theft. The IRS had calculated that my family owed over $300,000 in back taxes, penalties, and interest on their unreported income. Even after they served their prison sentences, they would be facing financial ruin for the rest of their lives. But perhaps the most satisfying consequence was the complete destruction of their reputations. The local news had covered every detail of the case, and everyone in our small city knew exactly what the Morrison family had done. Emma's friends had abandoned her when they realized her designer lifestyle had been funded by stolen money. Dad's colleagues at Morrison Construction had spoken publicly about feeling betrayed and disgusted. Mom had been forced to resign from her volunteer positions at local charities when the organizations realized they could not be associated with someone convicted of financial crimes. They had lost everything. Their freedom, their money, their homes, their social standing, and their family relationships. The only family they had left was each other, and they would be spending the next decade in separate federal prisons. Meanwhile, my life had completely transformed. Uncle David had helped me use my inheritance wisely. I had paid off my student loans, bought a reliable car, and put a down payment on a small house in a neighborhood I actually wanted to live in. But more importantly, I had used part of the money to go back to school to become a financial crimes investigator. If my experience had taught me anything, it was that there were probably other families out there being victimized by people like Emma and my parents. I had also connected with my birth mother's family and discovered that I had a biological aunt, uncle, and 2 cousins who welcomed me with the kind of unconditional love I had never experienced from my adoptive family. Rachel, my birth mother's sister, was a social worker who understood family trauma in ways that helped me process everything I had been through. "Jennifer would be so proud of you," Rachel told me during one of our weekly phone calls. She always believed in doing the right thing, even when it was difficult. The fact that you brought justice for what happened to her and what happened to you would have meant everything to her. The most unexpected development was my relationship with my grandfather's lawyer, Mr. Patterson. He had been so impressed with my investigation skills and my dedication to uncovering the truth that he had offered me a job at his law firm once I finished my studies. Working for someone who had genuinely cared about my well-being and had helped protect me from my family's crimes felt like the perfect career path. A year after my family's sentencing, I received a letter from Emma in prison. She had written several times, but this was the first letter I actually opened. "Sophia," it read, "I know I have no right to ask for your forgiveness, but I need you to know that I understand now how wrong we were. Prison has given me a lot of time to think about what we did to you, and I realize that we treated you terribly for your entire life. You worked 3 jobs while I lived off stolen money. You struggled to pay for groceries while I bought designer clothes with embezzled funds. You saved every penny for emergencies while I demanded that you give me your savings to fund more criminal activity." The letter continued for 3 pages, detailing all the ways my family had mistreated me and expressing what seemed like genuine remorse for their choices. But the part that stuck with me was the ending. "The worst part is that you were always the best person in our family, and we punished you for it. We punished you for being honest when we were criminals. We punished you for working hard when we preferred to steal. We punished you for being kind when we chose to be cruel. I understand now that you bringing justice down on us was not revenge, it was protecting other people from becoming our victims. I hope someday you can find peace with what happened, and I hope you know that you deserve all the happiness in the world." I never wrote back to Emma, but I kept the letter. Not because I forgave her, but because it confirmed what I had always known: I had made the right choice in exposing their crimes. 2 years after the sentencing, I graduated with honors from my criminal justice program and started working full-time as a financial crimes investigator. My first major case involved uncovering an embezzlement scheme remarkably similar to what my father had been doing, and I was able to help recover over $200,000 for the victim company. Uncle David moved to my city after he retired, and we have dinner together every Sunday. Rachel visits several times a year, and I have traveled to meet the rest of my biological family. For the first time in my life, I understand what it feels like to be part of a family that actually cares about your well-being. The $3,000 in savings that Emma demanded I give her was nothing compared to the $137,000 my grandfather had secretly set aside for me. But more than that, her demand for my money was what finally opened my eyes to the truth about what my family really was. Sometimes I think about what would have happened if I had just given Emma my savings that day. She would have taken my emergency fund to finance more criminal activity, and I would have continued working multiple jobs while remaining ignorant about the crimes being committed in my name and the inheritance I had been excluded from. Instead, Emma's greed and condescension led to the complete destruction of a criminal enterprise that had been operating for decades. Justice was not just served, it was served comprehensively and permanently. Now, when people ask me about family loyalty and whether blood is thicker than water, I tell them that loyalty must be earned through honest behavior and genuine care. The family you choose is often more valuable than the family you are born into or adopted into. And sometimes, the greatest act of love you can perform is holding people accountable for their choices, even when those people share your name. Have you ever discovered that people you trusted were living double lives that affected your well-being? Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and doing the right thing? I would love to hear your stories in the comments below. Sometimes the most powerful healing comes from knowing you are not alone in facing difficult family situations. If this story of family karma and justice resonated with you, please hit that like button to let me know. Subscribe for more real-life drama stories where truth eventually prevails and people face consequences for their actions. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear that sometimes walking away from toxic family members is the healthiest choice you can make. Thank you for joining me on this journey of discovering the truth about family betrayal and finding the strength to demand justice. I hope my experience helps you remember that you deserve honesty, respect, and genuine love from the people in your life, and that you never have to accept less than that, even from family. May you always have the courage to seek truth and the wisdom to choose the family members who truly deserve your loyalty.